HVACs, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. It's very common for people to keep their data centers really cold, and it's really not needed. It doesn't necessarily have an adverse effect on the equipment, but it can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year keeping it 5 or 10 degrees lower than it actually needs to be. Most vendors have set ranges for their equipment where it should be operated in the optimal conditions, and it ranges somewhere between 68 and 77 Fahrenheit or 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. They also have allowable ranges. That's where the equipment is going to continue to function, but it's not super good for the equipment. It will deteriorate faster and not work optimally. Those ranges are between 59 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 15 to 32 Celsius. Another side effect to keeping it too cold is it's going to raise the humidity levels. We obviously have humidity control in our data center as well. If we keep the temperature unnecessarily low, which then raises humidity, we're also going to expend more power pulling the humidity out of the room. I've been in many data centers where it's kept just around 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15.5 Celsius or even lower. First off, it's a waste of money to keep it that low. Also, it's miserable to work in for the people who are in the data center. So over the last 5 or 10 years, it has become common knowledge that it's okay to raise the temperature in a data center. As you can see in the charts from the vendors where they recommend their equipment be used, there's definitely some disagreement on what the optimal temperature is. And some vendors have very wide ranges of where the equipment is going to work well. Somewhere in the low 20s for Celsius or in the low 70s for Fahrenheit is probably a good range to shoot for. We also want to keep a positive pressure inside the data center. What that means is there's a slightly higher air pressure inside the room than there is outside. When someone enters the data center, the air should blow out, not into the data center. And we do this to keep the contaminants out. And we also keep our data centers cleaner than we keep the rest of the building just because of this. In our fire suppression, many of them use the particle density in the air to determine if they should put off the fire suppression or not. So keeping the positive pressure will keep the contaminants, keep the dust out, and hopefully we can keep our particle levels down and not set anything off inadvertently. I worked in a data center at some point that was pretty clean, but they didn't do the annual cleaning on the subfloors. The subfloor is where they ran all the cables, so they had good 1.5 feet or about 50 centimeters between the actual floor and the floor the data center was on. You then have a metal grid structure with tiles you can remove, and the tiles in the appropriate places are perforated so the air can get pushed up in the cold aisles and stay beneath the floor in the hot aisles. I'll show you some graphics on it later so you have a better idea of how it works. But what happened in that data center, they hadn't cleaned below the subfloor. Someone went in to pull cables. It was really dusty under there. The particle count rose and the fire suppression kicked in. Other than the fact that it was scary and one of the guys who was in there actually got knocked to his knees when the FM200 system kicked in, it cost about $30,000 to fill it up again. So obviously here, they implemented it every 3 months someone would come in and clean below the subfloors. A little bit of a sidetrack, but now you understand how it's important to keep the pressure slightly higher so we can keep the contaminants from the outside, well, out. We've touched on the humidity before. It should be kept somewhere between 40 and 60% relative humidity. Too low humidity will cause static electricity, which as we know can damage our equipment and corrupt our data. And too high humidity and it'll start corrode metals, which most of our servers are made of, so that's a really bad idea. In our HVAC systems, an integral part of those is both a humidifier and a dehumidifier to ensure we operate in that optimal range for humidity. And of course our HVAC should be spec'd to handle not just the heating and the air conditioning, but the humidity as well. If one of our AC breaks, can the last one or the other two handle the load? I've worked in data centers both where it's really dry, so we actually had to use the humidifier, and places where it's really humid, and we had to use the dehumidifier. So in your due diligence, figure out what the area you're in or the data center you're building is, and ensure that equipment can handle that environment. For the exam, and for your job if you are an IT security manager or someone in that range, you probably won't have to do the research, but as part of your due diligence and due care, you need to ensure that someone takes it into consideration. On the graphic here, you can see the sub-ceilings and the subfloors we talked about earlier. So the top blue line is the actual ceiling. The bottom blue line is the actual floor. And then remember, the walls we have are slab to slab, so they go from the true ceiling to the true floor. Then we have the raised floor, the subflooring. That's where all the cables are run, and also where that dust was gathered in that data center. When we put servers and networking equipment into our racks, they're all designed to be facing the same way. They have fans pulling air in one end and fans pushing it out in the other. The common design for a server is that the air intake is in the front and they push out of the air is in the back, and this is where the hot aisles and the cold aisles come in. So on the front side of the racks, we push cold air in, and we do this by having perforated grates in the floor, so the cooled air pushed in by the air conditioners can only exit out in the cold aisles, where all the servers take the air in. Then at the back of the racks, all the servers push the air out, and we have air outtakes at the top, above that where the air is pulled out through the AC unit. And that's really how we cool our data center. Since switches that are racked are used to plug in the networking cables that are located at the backs of the servers, the switches are in reverse. So when you walk through a data center, depending on where you stand, there can be a huge temperature difference. So if you're standing in the cold aisle, it can maybe be 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. And if you're standing in front of the exhaust of a massive server, the temperature can maybe be 105 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. That really is how we keep our equipment at optimal operations. And how we keep the airflow is critical too. If we just had perforated grates throughout the data center, we'd be pushing in the air all over the place and not where it's needed. We'd spend more money on power for our HVAC system, and the server would have to work harder to keep within their optimal range of operations. So having the hot aisles and the cold aisles makes a lot of sense, both financially as well as operationally. Throughout our subflooring, it's also common to have drains. Since in many places the HVAC units also serves as dehumidifiers, a lot of water is going to run through the HVAC system. Even if they don't, they do just build up natural condensation. And since we don't look below our subflooring on a daily basis, this can easily build up. So in our subflooring, we would have sensors. The sensors would pick up if there's any water present. We would most likely also have drains. If there is water, it can drain away, which is a smart idea, but it can also be a double-edged sword. What if the drain backs up, start pushing water out on our subflooring? So when we design our data center, we need to take all these considerations into place and figure out what's going to work for us. What do we feel comfortable with? What's going to be secure enough? The issue with water is the reason a lot of places don't run cables below the subflooring, don't run power down there, because electricity and water is a really bad mix. They will then use cable trays above the racks, just a large grid system. If we use Ethernet copper, then we would have separate ones for power and Ethernet. If we run our power cables and only fiber up there, they can be run the same trays, but many places still prefer to have separate trays, even if they're not susceptible to MI. We do many things in our data center to ensure there's no static electricity. We obviously have our humidity control. All our circuits are grounded, and whenever we touch and work on hardware, we at least use an anti-static wrist strap, but in some places they also use the anti-static shoes. They're not super pretty, but that's not really the point. They keep our equipment safe. So anyone who's working on our hardware, opening up servers, messing with the motherboards, cards, memory, hard disks, anything hardware really, needs to wear the anti-static wrist strap. It may not happen 999 times out of 1,000, but that one time can be catastrophical. So wear the wrist strap. For our fire suppression and our fire detection, we use different sensors, but what they detect and how they detect it can vary. And our fire suppression and our fire detection should obviously be attached to warning lights, sirens, and then the suppression system. A heat detector would be configured to trigger if a certain threshold is exceeded. It's an if-then system. If the temperature rises more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit in 5 minutes, then sound the alarm. Most of the systems are on a delay, so the alarm and the warning lights go off. Then there's a 20 or 30 second delay where staff can check is there an actual fire, and if there is, they can exit the area. And after the delay, the fire suppression system will kick in. The if then on the heat sensor could also be if the temperature is above 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 34 Celsius, then sound the alarm and start the timer. It's common to have people in the data center 24/7, or at least in an office close to it so they can monitor the equipment. If the alarm sounds, one employee will go into the data center, see if there is a fire or not, and the other will stand next to a turn-off switch, where there's a little button they have to hold in, and that will delay the fire suppression. As soon as they let go of it, if the timer has been reached, either the fire suppression will trigger, or the countdown will start again. 20 seconds later, the fire suppression will go off. We talked about the smoke sensors earlier. Those were the ones where when the particle density rose too high, they would trigger. They can either be ionization detectors, which have a small radioactive source that creates a small electric charge, or a photoelectric sensor that uses LED, that also produces a small charge while receiving light. They both trigger when smoke or high particle density interrupts the light or the radioactivity. And then finally we have flame detectors. They're not so commonly used, just like the infrared motion sensors. They detect infrared or ultraviolet light emitted by a fire. The downside to them is they need a line of sight to the fire.